On December 7th of 1941, the Japanese Empire launched a surprise bombing attack on Pearl Harbor, a United States naval base stationed in Hawaii. All of the U.S. battleships that were at this base were either totally destroyed or damaged to the point where they could not be used. This assault is what propelled the United States to declare war on Japan the very next day and therefore entering themselves into World War II. The attack on this base resulted in the death of 2,403 people, of which 2,335 were military personnel and 68 were civilians. Once the war was declared, men between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to register for the military draft. The draft was a system so that the military would be able to provide enough soldiers to fight. This was the first event of its kind to take place in the United States. The draft went on until all fighting was over. A grand total of 50 million men entered the draft, and by the end of the war, 10 million of those 50 million were selected and sent to join the armed forces. More than 12% of all Americans ended up serving in the war, and that number is huge compared to today's 0.5% of Americans serving in war. The majority of men that served in World War II were drafted. A total of 16.1 million Americans served, and 10 million were drafted. So needless to say, the draft had a profound effect on how the war was going to be fought on the American side.
At the time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was nearing the end of his second term when he announced that the United States would be entering World War II. The U.S. joining the war was mainly in response to the Pearl Harbor attack, but also to help countries in Europe from being taken over by Nazi Germany. He was the only president to serve 4 terms. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a prejudice was created against any Japanese American, even if they were a legal citizen of the United States. There were stereotypes against Japanese Americans, and many people wouldn't trust them because some thought that they were spies working for the Japanese government. In response to this newfound prejudice, Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. This order made anyone that was of Japanese descent forced to live in internment camps overseen by the military. More than 110,000 Japanese Americans, who mainly lived on the West Coast, were forced into these camps.
Due to the fact that women were not allowed to serve yet, and the majority of men did end up being drafted into the war, this led to women taking over the men's factory jobs and manufacturing while the men were overseas. Women would make weapons and supply the men serving in the war with any of their needs. This was a major step in the process for men and all people to begin treating women as equals. Although women were not paid as much as the men who did these jobs before them, they showed that they were just as capable to do a man's work just as well as any other man could.
During the war, every country knew that whoever possessed the most advanced technology and weapons were most likely to win the war. During this time, the Manhattan Project was put together that researched and produced the first nuclear weapons. The best minds of our country were put to this project to create these weapons of mass destruction. The Manhattan Project produced 2 nuclear bombs that were dropped on cities in Japan, which ended up making the Japanese surrender only a few days later. Some people thought that these atom bombs were too powerful and destructive, and also thought it was immoral to do such a thing. Even Albert Einstein stated, "I made one great mistake in my life, when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that the atom bombs be made. But there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make them first." There was also an emphasis on creating new weapons and mass producing them so that our soldiers would be well equipped to handle their business.